Thank you for having us. We're really glad to be a part of this. We have a wonderful and a part of Urban Design Week, yay, Institute for Urban Design. So our assignment was places hidden by infrastructure present another opportunity for interpretation. By the city, for the city, received a number of requests to give this space a second look, suggesting things like lighting installations in highway underpasses and development of space under bridge on-ramps. The problem, these kinds of locations are ugly and underused. Where better to create interesting public space? So let me do this. So there were more than 40 ideas submitted in the By the City, for the City ideas solicitation, and they ranged from let's tear down, many of them were like let's tear down the BQE. The thing is, it probably, certainly been better if it weren't built. But we're not here tonight to talk about tearing down anything. And there is a site called Freeways Without Futures. That's the Congress for New Urbanism that is, if you're interested in tearing down freeways. Anyway, wouldn't it be great, this is one of the ideas that was submitted, if all the leftover spaces under highways, bridges, and subways, and I would add trains, could be better lit and spaces used more creatively. Why would you say could be lit and used? Because they're very dark and they're usually not hardly able to be used at all. So that people could begin to explore a network of interesting and different spaces in the city, because I want the city to be unique and have corners of discovery and unexpected moments. And so, what are the steps to changing perception of these spaces that are dominated by elevated transportation infrastructure? We worked with, our group who's going to ask us a question. We did meet with Faith Rose and have a chance to meet briefly with Faith Rose and Emily Weidenhoff, I know I've said it wrong, of respectively DDC, DOT. And we sort of talked about how we approach what we call viaduct spaces underneath or around elevated transportation infrastructure. Spaces that would never be built today because of the way transit-oriented design and many other initiatives are operative, but that exist in the cities, often in underserved areas or at the edges and so on. But the first thing, one of the things that came out of our discussion was the needing to open up the question, to break it down, and to recognize the differences between different infrastructures, that they aren't all the same, that some are, most elevated highways are very solid, and they tend to be rather low. They can be there are many uses for those kind of spaces, but also they tend to be quite dark. The elevated subway is often more open and lets light down, but can be extremely chaotic visually as well, due to the ways that there have been successive put-ups and takedowns over time. Neither highway nor elevated subway had within its mandate to care about the person's experience of most of that infrastructure, as opposed to, say, bridges, which are thought to be beautiful icons and symbols of urbanity and so on. And so even though the spaces underneath and up close might not always be as sublime as from the Brooklyn Bridge from above and far away, there's still spaces that have, that are thought aesthetically in some way, whereas these others are not. And so ways to open up the question also, we know highways don't really, elevated subways and elevated trains are for us. We can get on them. And so there's transit hubs that has this potential to become, especially with the way the city has been rezoning areas to encourage development near mass transit, public transit, that there's really there's leverage points for positive transformation if thought through design, whereas highways, elevated highways, you're not going to walk up and get on the highway. So it's really about being under it, crossing it, and so on. But all these kind of structures divide neighborhoods and have the potential to connect neighborhoods.
So we thought that we would bring two test cases. One that we are a little bit familiar is the tangle of elevated subways in Queens Plaza. You see here a diagram. What we think is going on is that it tends to be very dark and very confusing, and you see in the diagram that there are different levels of transit, and at the same time there is an overwhelming presence of cars. The presence of abandoned tracks is what we're focusing on, and we're saying, why don't you lit them, and why don't you make them into wayfinding devices so that the traffic can find its way, and at the same time other kind of interventions can be thought for areas that might have been previously thought as parking, so that at the end the historical presence of these infrastructures could be rethought again in terms of a larger urban landscape that also offers wayfinding devices by lighting these structures from within. This is the case of the lazy, messy, layered condition of elevated subways, where the tangle of steels often confuses the perception of them and makes them look, in fact, more complicated than they are, because in fact they were built at the turn of the century with very regular modules that could be highlighted and could be brought back to their role of civic lanterns. A different case is, as Linda said before, is a solid case. Instead of having a tangle of stuff up there in the sky that casts light and shadows, but at the same time is so layered that one feels overwhelmed by that, there are solid slabs. It could be an elevated highway, it could be an elevated train. And that's the case that we looked at in the terms of the train viaduct. This is an intersection which is very charged and very significant potentially as a civic spot of identity. And it is a very, very dark space underneath the elevated train line at the MTA at 125th and Park Avenue, where there is a station and there is at the same time an abandoned space and an abandoned back space to the street that is particularly confusing and dark and not inviting at all. In fact, at the end, this viaduct, as you probably know, divides 125th in two very separate chunks. So we thought, well, because it's solid, you can do a couple of things. You can paint it white, and you can uplit it. And then it becomes this sort of canopy of light within which then one can imagine different kind of initiatives and social occupations, which eventually could also, for example, rely on a number of elements that are part of the vocabulary that the city is adopting in terms of street furniture and kiosks and ways to inhabit the space, and maybe having a different kind of lighting as opposed to sort of an uplit cathedral type of lighting, something that is more focused on the use of the ground, something that comes down for this brighten up surface on the top. So these two examples, the lazy and messy one and the solid and dark one, could be addressed through lighting and could be addressed in ways that become both places and relationship with larger landscapes or social uses underneath them.
And so I think certainly there's a lot more to the story, how most of these structures are in their own rights of way, so there's a lot of potential for solar photovoltaic power. There's tremendous issues of stormwater runoff management on most elevated structures, so there's a great potential to integrate that into making spaces for people. But in any case, when we talked just this earlier, this last week with Emily and Faith, the ribbons are what they were saying, like what would be next steps. And Faith said, well, and I'm not trying to take away her lines, because I know she'll have more to say. But the idea that maybe there starts to be a critical mass of projects, because there's a number of different one-off projects. So you can see here on the upper left, there's a skate park, there's a movie theater on the right, there's a market, there's Space Buster, which was this Raumlabor, this arts group, was here last year with Storefront for Art and Architecture, and this is under BQE, making a workshop about what could happen under there. And, but the idea that there could start to be a critical mass of projects that could provide examples and proof of concept and so on, that's one of the kinds of steps, is to start to gather those projects. We also, this is probably too small to see, maybe not. This was actually from our urban shed project that we called Performance Shed, and we did think about it as a laboratory for trying out different kinds of things that you could do with an infrastructure, a temporary infrastructure, and also with covered urban spaces. And so thinking of viaduct spaces as, thinking of viaducts, elevated infrastructure as high performance infrastructure. High performance in the sense that it does more things, that it not only carries the train or the subway or the car and works at that scale, metropolitan regional scale for transit, but that it contributes to public life and urban space and stormwater management and many things. And so this was a kind of catalog of parts, and the drawing was made by Becky Urich, who also did put together this presentation. So I do want to recognize her and all of our office. But the idea that integrating bike rack seating and so on like that, because as we've come to understand infrastructure in a fuller, richer sense, these infrastructures that were built, more than 100 years ago, in some cases, less in the case of the highways, but that in the case of the subway is the backbone and enabler of our city, that they have the potential to, in the 21st century, also be enabling and in new ways that we are excited about continuing to investigate and hopefully realize.
Thank you.
Oh, more, yeah, that's fine.